welcome to another session of the Inventors Circle video podcast. Today, we are going to do our second episode of the development of human flight.
Yes, flight of fancy. So now we've seen some of the early pioneers, and really, to be honest, some of it was very comical. Although they were trying their very best, we now enter into a period of development which is a little bit more serious. Exotic materials such as balsa wood, rattan, silk, certain new types of metals were being applied to the solution of making a much lighter, stronger aircraft. So we're just going to put in some slides and we'll take it from there. Thanks. To 1918, and 15 years have gone by. So Bob, what happened in those 15 years?
Yeah, it's funny because some of the smartest people in the world, for example, Lord Kelvin, had been making pronouncements saying that anything heavier than air will never fly.
Yeah, he's the famous guy that made up the temperature gate, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So very, very well known.
Yes. So in the first episode, we have seen some of the inventors working with their prototypes and almost laughing. We were laughing with the amount of funny things breaking and people falling and hurting.
Yeah, and no real science behind them. Yes,
that's right. Yeah, but the Wright brothers had it correct. They basically got this plane together. Not only did they build the right frame, but they already had the combustion engine that already existed. What their contribution really was the propeller. They had two propellers that are handmade out of wood, and in 1903, and for the first time, they flew for 1 minute and 43 seconds.
So when we think of the propeller, I actually think that we can probably realize that propellers were used by boats far earlier than the aircraft, right? So who actually invented the propeller properly?
Well, the original screw was invented by Archimedes already in the old Greek.
Right, but it didn't have individual blades. It only had one continuous screw, right? So who actually invented the modern propeller?
The ship propeller was basically invented by John Ericsson in 1838. It was.
Wow.
He put a patent in, and he was Swedish, and he was working on the canal system, and that's how he basically got the idea to propel the ships with a screw rather than
a water wheel.
A water wheel.
Yeah, this is the old wet wheel boat. The Mark Twain, the old paddle boats.
Or in the canals, they used to pull them with horses as well.
Wow. So there was that leap of sort of imagination of the Wright brothers that they could probably cut the air like the propeller cuts the water.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the propeller is much longer, much thinner, much lighter.
Yes. So basically, the propeller that they made was the first one to work.
Wow. So I think we come to the realization that there's 5 or 6 different key things going on to make an aircraft work. It's the wing that gives the lift to the aircraft, with the power of the propeller and the engine pushing the wing into the air to give it lift. So if the motors aren't big and the propellers aren't big, that means the wings have to be really big, which makes the aircraft really hard to control. So really we start to enter into a period of experimentation between wing size, control, power, and I mean, in the same time, we will be remiss not to mention lighter than air aircraft, like the Zeppelin. We'll be doing an individual discussion about what is the difference between a dirigible and a Zeppelin type. Of World War I, really started to propel some ideas that had come just before the war. Yeah. So what are some of those ideas that came before the war that were sort of revolutionary?
Well, what actually amazed me so much in reading up on this is that from 1903, it took less than 10 years for people to make the first powered flight, to in less than 10 years in the end of the World War I, we had hundreds and hundreds of airplanes, fighter planes flying around, fighting a war. That's amazing in less
Hmm.
than in that
And
short of.
again, it's the constraints being removed from the creative genius, money and resources being given to the inventors, and real tight timelines. Things have to work. I mean, if they don't work during a war, then you lose. I mean, there's a famous story of the Germans focusing on technology and training their pilots, whereas the Allies, the British the French were focused on volume, and then they unfortunately had a fight in 1915
Mhm.
where the were outclassed by the Germans, and they were shot down at a factor of 6-1. So the
Mhm.
reign of the Red Baron, if you've ever heard of Red Baron, was a very real thing. And a three-wing or tri-winged aircraft allowed it to turn very fast. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later about how that works. So, what about Kaiser Wilhelm and Queen Victoria? They were actually cousins, weren't they?
Well, Kaiser William was a nephew of
Oh, nephew.
Queen Victoria, and so was the emperor in Russia as well. Was also
Right.
another nephew.
Oh,
The whole family was running more than half of the world. You
right.
know,
I'm gonna make for odd dinners when you said you bombed my thing. Yes, I'm very sorry, cousin.
but
Uh,
but during the beginning of 1900 is also the start of people building dirigible balloons,
right.
and Kaiser Wilhelm was completely excited, ecstatic about, because he thought that building lighter than air airships are going to be used in a military fashion, and he will win all wars after that.
Of course, I
So
mean, clearly the difference between a blimp and a dirigible has a structure, an actual fixed metal or a material structure, where a blimp is
yeah,
basically just a balloon that's shaped
mhm.
like a dirigible. But obviously, we know what happened to Hindenburg, and we'll be doing an entire series on that. Hydrogen is very explosive, and due to a couple of catastrophic dirigibles, British and German, that kind of put the end, at least in this century, in the
Mhm.
19th and 20th century, on light in the aircraft.
Yeah, something strange always happens during wars because all the inventions that are related to the war are being accelerated so much, and all the other stuff is kept behind. So
Yes,
imagine, nowadays we are sending a robot to Mars, but and yet the thing behind my toilet keeps breaking down all the time.
right.
So,
Well, obviously, nobody wants to go butcher your toilet, but everybody wants to go to Mars for some reason. I will say this. One of the things that also accelerates a lot of at least the deployment of inventions is the government during the War Act in America and England and even Germany were able to scour through potential patents and basically take them from their owners. So sometimes if you create something like chocolate toothpaste, you might be better off than coming up with a cure for cancer, because there is a high tendency of governments to say, oh, this is essential for the national interest, and just take your invention. Now, again, if you do have a cure for something, you might just say, yes, I'll give it away because that's the right thing to do. But just understand that your patents are a relationship between you and the government. The idea is that you will share your information and they will promise you protection. The idea that at some point your protection will fall away and then the information will be public knowledge. This is a way of building out the body knowledge of the society. So instead
mhm.
of an agreement that's made, so your patent's never good forever. And to share it,
Yeah.
eventually it will expire.
Meanwhile, during all this time, Nikola Tesla was hard at work. He already had invented the AC generator in 1882, but since we're talking about human flight development, Tesla also contributed quite a bit to that. He invented the VTOL,
Which
also
is a vertical takeoff.
vertical takeoff, like a helicopter. He also made drawings of a jet engine. Of course, he contributed wireless and remote control, and eventually apparently also free energy. So therefore, he was being suppressed. That most of the U.S. government, the military, and some of the richest people that were funding him basically got became scared of him. They could not understand someone who was so far ahead of everybody else. So they cut funding, they cut his funding, and instead of honoring him, they start putting Edison and Einstein on platforms and basically start ignoring Tesla altogether, almost in like a psyop. They also invented the expression mad scientist in order to basically
Discredit him.
discredit him as much as they possibly could.
Well, I mean, we now know that he was a genius. I do think, to a greater or lesser extent, people always question the allegiance of somebody who isn't born there. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the 19th century, it would be a question of his allegiance since he was Serbian, even though
Mm-hmm.
he always professed a love of the United States and never really lived anywhere else. After he moved to the U.S., he would travel, but he was almost universally
Mm-hmm.
lived in America. So
Mm-hmm.
sad indictment on the history of governments. Doesn't really change
Mm-hmm.
much, unfortunately. Um,
But it's not unusual for governments to dislike inventors and people that are ahead of their time. So, for example, Da Vinci, uh, was not treated very well either. He was kicked around quite a bit, and eventually he got summoned to come and live in the Vatican for many many years before he took off to France and where he died. Look at Galileo, who merely said that the sun is turning around the earth.
oh yeah,
And the
yes,
other
yeah,
one,
yeah, yeah.
he got
We
he
know the Earth goes around the sun
yeah he
rather
got
than the
yeah.
sun goes around the Earth, which was
So he
not
got
well liked. Yeah.
so he got convicted and put under house arrest for the rest of his life.
Well, he recanted.
Yes,
He was
and then
let
there
off.
was and then there was the one of the worst cases was an Italian astronomer by the name of Giordano Bruno. He was a brilliant scientist who declared already before the year 1600 that the universe was infinite size and there was most likely life in the universe. For that statement, he spent 9 years in a dungeon,
And then he was
and then he
barbecued.
and then he got taken out in the year 1600 and was basically burnt at the stake in public.
Yes.
So,
So that two things that always seems to go once against the other is the visionary against the money. And one of the most critical parts of money is always status quo seeks to get their return financially on the what is called sunk costs. They've already put money into certain technologies, and if you hop
mhm,
ahead and jump forward and make their technology obsolete,
mhm,
well, then you're an enemy for sure. So when you're inventing, if you can think of ways to have an ultimate invention, you might be better off making two or three reiterations of the invention that could maybe go to market and make money for the investors, and then slowly move towards your ultimate invention. Because if you suddenly come up with a way to make cars irrelevant, planes irrelevant, trains irrelevant, you probably will not be hailed as a hero. You people who would want that, but the people who make trains, planes, and cars will become your instantaneous enemy. So, and this has happened throughout history, from the electric car and elsewhere. But we digress from our
yeah,
discussion of airplanes. So now, just a quick look at some of the aircrafts that did the what we call dogfighting.
yeah,
Two of the most noteworthy of these aircraft are the biplane and the triplane, and then they come in very many different configurations. Why two wings on three wings instead of one wing? Well, more modern aircraft tend to have one wing. Well, simply it's a function of strength versus lift. The longer the wing is, the more lift you have. Unfortunately, the longer the wing is, the harder it is to turn. It's like a figure skater pulls their arms into turn. we'll see in a video. So it is with the wing. So they had to have the wing shorter. So to accommodate the same amount of lift, they added two and then later three wings to create enough lift. Now, the three wing configuration had an issue because every wing you add adds drag. So they did try a four wing, by the way, and it some pilots liked it. Unfortunately, in certain wind conditions, you lost control of the aircraft
Mm-hmm.
because there's so much uh, pitch and yaw on the wing, you can't control it. But in this period, for the beginning, people were really only shooting at each other with handguns. Later on, we move into a period of the interrupter. We're going to see a video of a machine gun ingeniously that can shoot through the propeller and show you how that was invented.
Yeah. Let's also look at a very interesting thing. Also, I find is the development of the parachute. Most people associate parachutes with airplanes, but people don't understand that parachutes were already invented and used more than 300 years before we had airplanes. So that's quite incredible.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
But can you imagine being the first person who was probably told, given the era, told to jump out of a balloon or off the
yeah,
building?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the first one to actually conceive the idea is Leonardo da Vinci, who made the drawings of parachutes already in 1495.
Mm-hmm. But they
It,
were wood frame, and it wasn't a collapsible thing. It was a
mhm.
looks more like a
It was
pyramid on string,
was a frame. Yeah, it
a
was a
frame. Yeah.
frame. Yeah, but it took almost 122 years after that for the first person who was in 1617, uh, a Croatian man by the name of Vranjek, uh, jumped from a tall building in the city of Venice,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and he is going down in history as the first person to make a proper.
Was that a water landing? Did he jump
No,
onto water? No, because you see
no, I
this in
don't think
Venice.
so. No, no,
I
I
think
don't know. Oh, maybe it is.
maybe
Maybe it is in water. I don't
I
know.
would
Yeah,
probably, if I was going to jump off something, I'd probably want to jump over water just in case.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And so once the parachutes with a rigid framework became hard to deal with, a French man by the name of Blanchard in 1785 uh, basically start making the parachutes that will fold up and made them out of silk, and so that became the
Because
modern
silk is one of the strongest fabrics.
and is
Yes.
the modern parachute. And it wasn't until 1797 that another Frenchman, a balloonist known by the name of André Jacques Garnerin, he did the first historical jump, almost a kilometer down from a balloon, actually,
Hmm.
in 1797.
I mean, I
So,
had some thought about the development of the parachute, and obviously, while people realize the ability to descend slowly, I really think this is more a early stages, an attempt at a form of glider. It's kind of a controlled fall, you
mhm.
know. Later on, obviously there was a real need because if you're in a balloon and it starts to collapse, you might need to be able to escape. So that's what's driving the need for parachute. Ironically, though, even though the first parachutes were really used from 1911, very few of the early pilots in World War II wore parachutes. And you
Yes.
look at the pictures; they did later in the war have parachutes. But the vast majority of them felt that it was dishonorable to leave your aircraft, similar to the
Hmm.
the old tradition of the captain whose ship goes down with the ship. If you can't land it,
That's right.
then you don't have any reason to be alive.
Hmm.
Airplanes are pretty expensive, so it's like go down with your ship sort of situation. So very interesting. And yet again, like we see that less than from the end of World War II into World War One into World War II, we see that it becomes a standard operating procedure for militaries.
Yes.
Thousands of men drop from the air.
Yeah. So let's get into the next section, which is from 1920 basically to 1945. And of course, that includes the Second World War,
Right.
right?
So yes, well, I think one of the things that I we really want to highlight would be a really a mess if we didn't mention this. Canadians have always played a major role in every conflict that the Commonwealth has been involved in,
Mhm.
whether it's World War I, whether it's World War II, Korea, and elsewhere. Canadians are the faithful allies of both the Americans and the British. And in this
Yeah.
time,
So in 1927, a Canadian by the name of Wallace Turnbull basically invented the variable pitch propeller, right, very close to where we
very
are here in Ontario, Camp Borden, military camp. He got around quite a bit. He actually worked for Edison in 1905. He set up his, and he also set up his own wind tunnel in New Brunswick afterwards. The first wind tunnel ever to be built in Canada for that reason. And so he also called it, and uh, Alexander Graham Bell, who is known for the telephone, basically also did a lot of work in aviation, which very few people really know because he
mhm.
didn't become famous because of it.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, it's very hard to outdo the telephone.
but he also worked with Turnbull and made some significant advances in aviation.
So, with regards to the wind tunnel, more and more the designs and technical problems and issues of aircraft became more and more sophisticated. As the power of the engines increased, we went from inline rotary engines to inject fuel injected motors to turbo, jet turbo, and even towards the end of the word, jet engines, straight up jet engines. So, the big issue here had been all of these aircraft were not pressurized. And as the threat of enemy fighters attacking bombers, the bombers flew higher and higher and higher. And thus, it was a need to test the engines and other equipment in conditions that matched the environment they were flying in. So, the wind tunnels, not only in the US, especially in Ohio, started to test the airspeed for aerodynamic issues, also tested for temperature. They would refrigerate the air and it also draw a vacuum so they
Mhm.
could get closer and closer to the thin air conditions.
Yeah, so the modern jet engine basically was invented during the 1920s already. Even though Tesla made some drawings, the first patent that was actually submitted was a Frenchman called Maxime Guillaume, and that was in
Hang on a second.
1921.
How come, and I'm not going to say this because you're Belgian, but how
Yeah,
come every time we have a invention, suddenly a French guy pops up right at the beginning?
well, but
It's never an Irishman. It's
yeah, but
always
he was
a.
yeah, but he was way ahead of
Oh, of
everybody
course, the
else.
Irish never did anything but make potatoes.
Unfortunately, his invention was never constructed because for some reason the compressors alloys were not compatible and could not be
And this is
advanced
something we
enough.
see with Tesla as well. Some of his visions, while
Mhm.
they were tested later on, worked. At the time, the actual metallurgy or materials or the fuels just couldn't
Mhm.
meet up to the design.
Mhm.
This is
So
something to keep in mind as an inventor. Sometime you might have an idea for an amazing ship or plane or spaceship, but the materials that you need to make it happen don't exist. So maybe that's your first invention is
yeah.
create that material.
So the interesting story also, the real inventor who is credited with the invention of the jet engine is a British man, Sir Frank Whittle. Uh, he was, of course, in the Royal Air Force as an officer, and uh, he worked on this idea on by himself, uh, and then he basically presented it to his leaders in the army and to the government eventually. And funny enough, the English government was not at all interested.
In the 30s when nobody
Interested.
had job or
It was
food
not interested
in
in,
a fancy jet engine.
And then the war broke out, and then they panicked, of course. And the British beat, and the Germans actually beat them to it. The British man by the name of Hans von
You mean they're not a
Ohain,
British or German?
the German physicist Hans von Ohain, was the first person in the world to fly a plane with a jet power,
Yeah, the
basically.
Henkel HE
The Henkel, yeah,
178.
yeah.
Now, the story about this Henkel is a very interesting one because there obviously more than one company was creating jet engines, even in Germany. So BMW, before they made cars, were engine manufacturers, and they were creating an engine. Yonker was creating an engine,
Mhm.
and it came down to a situation of design and cost.
Mhm.
And the German high command decided, Luftwaffe, the Air Force, decided that the Henkel was more reliable and cheaper to build.
Mhm.
So,
So they basically, during the war, since 1942, they have the Messerschmitt, which is the first jet
well,
plane to actually
the
work in
the M
during the
yeah,
war.
M202,
Yes,
yes, and I
yes.
mean, and Hitler famously said it needs to be a bomber. So while its designation was a fighter aircraft bomber, they never really used it in that capacity. And due to similar to what happened to the Japanese, the constraints on materials ultimately led to it not coming soon enough to really make a difference in the war. Although it did have some
Mhm.
operational
Yeah.
things, it did show the way to the future. And one of the things that we will end this video on is just some thoughts around Operation Bullhorn. So many people have heard of Operation Paperclip, where German scientists were spirited away to
Mhm.
the U.S. and England to well, Operation Spear is a British one to get the scientists and the Russians did the same to work on their space programs. Operation Bullhorn was an operation to find all these old aircrafts, designs, missiles, and whatnot, and to incorporate some of the technology. So many of the designs that we knew in World War II, the Germans had designed, suddenly show up in the Korean War as a Sabre jet and other things. Now, any Americans out there get upset. No, they weren't a straight up ripoff, but definitely the underlying principles were used by the scientists. They acknowledge
Mhm.
that. So we now enter into a non-war period, and we call this the beginning of the space race. So we have Sputnik, we have the beginning of the realization that aircraft go higher, pressurization of
Mhm.
cabins. What happens in 1947, Bob?
In 47, yes, basically the first uh, pilot, he was actually a U.S. Air Force test
Test pilot,
pilot
yeah.
who basically got confirmed as having exceeded the speed of sound for the first time in history.
Right.
That's in
I mean,
1947.
and his name is Chuck Yeager, although
Chuck
we have it here
Yeager.
as Charles Elwood Yeager. He always went by Chuck, and he's still
Chuck.
alive. He's
Yeah.
still active in the aviation space, which is an
Hmm.
amazing thing after so many years.
Hmm.
And
So.
in exotic alloys, other materials, and really the sophistication in high altitude,
Yeah.
long range aircraft reliability because of the need to fly nuclear weapons as a
Yes.
deterrent against Soviet Union and Soviet, but likewise created this situation. But again, guess what came back in the domestic period? A good old friend of ours, the evil sunk costs. We can't afford it. How are we going to make money? Who's going to advertise it?
Mhm.
And so, if this is what you're familiar with, it's a very
Mhm.
sad thing. But let us just finish here. Okay. Okay. And don't always keep going. And okay. So now we're back. This is quite interesting. We're getting much closer to the aircraft as we know today, right, Paul?
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. So, this is quite interesting. We're getting much closer to the aircraft as we know today, right, Paul?
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. So, but something to keep in mind here is from an inventor point of view is if you find yourself in a period like a war where there's a real need for certain inventions, you're going to succeed if the invention meets the season or the time in which you're inventing. I mean, right now, we're in a period of social distancing. sanitation and this thing. If you created a type of sanitation device or type of detergent, say 3, 4 years ago, people would be, gee, thanks, not interested. Now they'd be knocking your door down. So, you have to really think about what you're doing. If you're inventing a board game where cards have to be shared, probably not going to find a good market right now. I mean, not unless it comes with its own Purell kit. So maybe you want to redesign that to make it a little bit social distancing. But one of the things I would also like to point out is even though the war kind of constrained a lot of art, literature, and other things, a lot of really interesting things were kind of helped besides airplane from this aviation period, like
Hmm.
medicine. What else, Bob?
Radar,
Radar. Yeah, that's a good one.
radar,
So we wouldn't be able to
military.
navigate without radar.
Well,
Uh,
radar was basically invented by Nikola Tesla again, but the
don't tell the British that.
military aircraft radar was basically developed in Britain during the Second World War.
Right, and it made a huge difference in the Battle of Britain. But I
Hmm.
think
Hmm.
what we have to understand here is that ideas stack upon ideas. So whatever might have happened maybe for war could be used in peacetime. But people tend to want guns and war and butter and peace. So you just make sure that you're inventing or at least putting forward the invention that suits the period in which you're inventing, or you're going to have a pretty hard go of it. And one last thing I'd like to talk about is that evil sunk costs. You've always need to figure out who is doing what and try to avoid bumping direct power with very powerful allies, as Tesla did many times. He was right, but he found himself on the outside financially and socially because he would not or could not take his great and high visions and
Hmm.
bring them down to sort of incremental growth, which is what the market in many cases wants, incremental growth. So if you make a flying car that supplants planes, boats, airplanes, and even bicycles, maybe you're not going to be well liked. Maybe
No,
people love you, but the people who make those other vehicles definitely not going to collaborate with you because you're a threat.
yeah,
So,
and in our talking about the flying cars and that in our third episode, we will be talking about what happened since 1945 till the present, and
right.
there's quite a bit of
All through the space
very
program,
exciting
and
stuff. Yeah.
also we'll be discussing the big question: why was there such a huge gap between the mid '70s all the way up until Elon Musk started making SpaceX happen? So, more politics. All right.
Yes.
Well, thank you. We'll see you again. Bye.
See you in the next session.